Justice in the shadows in a bustling neighborhood on the edge of a city, where the streets echoed with the rhythms of hard work and the hum of daily life. A story was unfolding that would forever change the lives of many. Chapter 1. The start of something new. Diana Hunter sat at her desk in her modest office, the walls lined with case files and the faint scent of old leather binding the air. Her fingers hovered over her computer keyboard, a few seconds of hesitation before typing the next letter. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she ran a hand through her short, coiled hair. The weight of her position, her role in this world, was both a burden and a privilege. Diana was a lawyer, a woman of fierce conviction and unwavering resolve. She had worked tirelessly to get where she was, and she knew the fight was far from over. In a predominantly white law firm, she was often one of the few faces of color, but she didn't let that intimidate her. In fact, it fueled her determination. She had seen how the scales of justice could tip so easily against people like her clients, the working-class Black families who often found themselves trapped by systems that didn't have their best interests at heart. Her phone rang, cutting through her moment of contemplation. Diana leaned forward and picked up the receiver. "Diana Hunter," she answered, her voice steady and sharp. "Miss Hunter, I need your help," a strained voice said from the other end of the line. It was a woman, her tone heavy with distress. "My family and I, we're being pushed out of our home. The landlord, he's racist, and he's making our lives miserable. I don't know what to do." Diana's heart sank. She had heard these stories too many times before. But this one, something about the voice on the other end, struck a chord. She grabbed a pen and began scribbling down the details. "I'm listening." "Tell me everything." Chapter 2. The case of the Walker family. The Walkers were a Black family that had lived in their rented home for nearly a decade. The house, a 2-story structure with faded red bricks and an overgrown garden, had become a place of refuge. But recently, it had become a battlefield. The landlord, a man named Nathaniel Brooks, had started to make the Walkers' lives unbearable. Initially, it was small things: raising the rent without warning, neglecting to fix plumbing issues, and then sending anonymous letters with veiled threats. As the months passed, it escalated. Brooks began making racist remarks when he visited the property and started showing up at odd hours, demanding that the Walkers vacate. Diana had heard this before: an aggressive, predatory landlord using his power to intimidate and manipulate. The idea of forcing people out of their homes was not new, but there was something different about this case. The Walkers weren't going to back down. "I'm going to take the case," Diana said with conviction. "We'll fight him in court. I won't let you lose your home." Chapter 3. The battle begins. Diana's first meeting with the Walker family was a sobering one. Maria Walker, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, sat beside her teenage daughter, Jasmine, whose eyes were filled with both fear and hope. The husband, Marcus, was a towering figure who kept his silence, but the tension in his muscles was palpable. The family had been through so much, and yet they still managed to hold on to each other. "Tell me everything," Diana said, leaning forward, her tone gentle but firm. Maria spoke first, her voice trembling as she described the incidents. Nathaniel Brooks had increased the rent multiple times in the past 2 years, each time citing market conditions in the neighborhood. But Maria knew the truth. The property values in their area were soaring, and Brooks was hoping to gentrify the space, pushing out families like the Walkers in favor of wealthier, predominantly white tenants. "He's trying to get us out," Maria said, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "Every time we ask for repairs, he ignores us. And when he does come, it's like we're invisible to him, like we're nothing." Jasmine, sitting beside her mother, spoke up. "He called us the wrong kind of people to live here. He said our kind doesn't belong in the neighborhood." Diana felt a sharp pain in her chest. The weight of systemic racism, The very thing she fought against every day was on full display here. But she wasn't about to let this family lose their home. She would take on this fight, no matter how difficult it seemed. The legal system was stacked against people like the Walkers' black families in predominantly white neighborhoods had been discriminated against for decades. But Diana had studied the laws, learned how to fight this kind of battle, and she wasn't afraid of going toe-to-toe with someone like Nathaniel Brooks. Chapter 4. The showdown. The courtroom was packed the day Diana walked in with the Walkers. Nathaniel Brooks, sitting across from her at the defendant's table, wore an expression of cold arrogance. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, his hair graying at the temples, and his suit looked freshly pressed. But there was something in his eyes that Diana recognized, the look of someone who believed they were above reproach. Untouchable, Diana's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. This was not just about the Walkers. It was about standing up for every marginalized person who had ever been pushed aside in this world. She rose to her feet, turning toward the judge with confidence. "Your Honor, this case is about more than just a landlord trying to evict tenants," she began. "This is about a pattern of discrimination. A landlord using his position of power to drive out a black family simply because they don't fit the image he wants for this neighborhood." She looked directly at Brooks, her gaze unwavering. "We have evidence of repeated harassment, intimidation, and racial discrimination. This man has violated both state and federal laws protecting renters." Brooks' lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man, tried to interrupt, but Diana was ready for him. She had anticipated every argument. She laid out the evidence methodically: the rent hikes, the ignored repairs, the threatening letters, and the witnesses who had overheard Brooks making racist remarks about the family. Brooks squirmed in his seat as the truth began to unfold. His smug expression faltered. He had underestimated Diana. He had underestimated what the Walkers stood for. Chapter 5. A turn of events. In the midst of the trial, an unexpected development occurred. Brooks, realizing the severity of the situation, began to panic. He had always relied on his wealth and privilege to intimidate people, but this time, the walls were closing in the night before the final arguments. Diana received a tip. A local journalist who had been following the case sent her a cryptic message: "Brooks is planning to skip town. He's packing up. He knows he's about to lose." Diana had to act fast. She called in a few favors, and the next morning, the news broke. Brooks had fled, leaving behind his property, his assets, and most importantly, his reputation. His disappearance only fueled the fire of the case. Proving just how guilty he was, the court ruled in favor of the Walkers, ordering Brooks to pay damages for his discriminatory actions. The Walkers were not only allowed to stay in their home, but were also awarded a settlement that allowed them to repair the damage Brooks had neglected for years. Chapter 6. The victory. The day the decision was announced, the Walkers were overcome with emotion. Maria cried openly, thanking Diana for everything she had done. Marcus, usually a man of few words, pulled her into a tight embrace. Jasmine smiled, her eyes bright with hope for the future. Diana, standing beside them, felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a win for the Walkers. It was a win for all the families who had suffered in silence, for all the people who had been pushed to the edges of society. And though the fight was far from over, Diana knew she had done something meaningful. She had stood up when no one else would. She had given a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. A new beginning. Months later, Diana stood in front of her office window, looking out at the busy street below. She was still the same lawyer, but something had changed within her. She was no longer just fighting for individual cases. She was fighting for justice, for equality, for the community. The Walkers had become friends. Maria had started a community group to help other families who faced similar struggles, and Jasmine had gone on to study law, inspired by Diana's example. Diana smiled to herself, knowing that even in a world full of injustice, sometimes one voice could make all the difference. And with that, the battle for justice continued.